He thought he had caught a thief in his own house. But what Adrian Moretti found that night would haunt him far more than any betrayal. Naomi Carter had learned how to move through the Moretti mansion without a sound, like a shadow slipping across marble and gold. In a house where crystal chandeliers glowed above 12-seat dinners, and silver trays carried more food than some families saw in a week, invisibility was the only thing that kept her safe. She cleaned quietly, spoke only when spoken to, and kept her eyes lowered whenever Adrian Moretti passed through the halls with that cold, controlled presence that made every servant stiffen. At 36, Adrian was the kind of man people noticed before he said a word. Tall, broad-shouldered, always dressed like power itself had been tailored to fit him. He carried silence the way other men carried anger. And Naomi had made it her mission never to be the reason that silence turned in her direction. But hunger had a way of breaking rules pride tried to keep. It was just after midnight when she slipped into the pantry off the main kitchen. Her stomach knotted so tightly it made her dizzy. The dinner party upstairs had ended an hour earlier. The guests had laughed over imported wine, thick-cut steaks, buttered asparagus, and desserts dusted in gold flakes no one had even finished. Naomi had cleared their plates with steady hands and an empty stomach, breathing in the smell of roasted garlic and warm bread while pretending it did not make her weak. Staff meals had come and gone before she finished scrubbing the back hall, and no one had saved her anything. No one ever did. So now she crouched in the dark corner of the pantry, beside shelves lined with olive oil from Italy and preserves flown in from France, holding a small paper plate of leftovers she had pieced together from what was already headed for the trash. A few bites of steak, half a dinner roll, 2 spoonfuls of mashed potatoes gone cold. She ate quickly, using her fingers because she didn't dare make noise with a fork. Her hands trembled from shame more than hunger. Naomi Carter had never stolen a thing in her life. Not when she was raising herself. Not when she worked double shifts to keep the lights on for her younger brother. Back in Newark. Not when she skipped meals so her mother could fill prescriptions. But crouching in the dark to eat another person's leftovers made her feel smaller than she had ever felt. Then the pantry door opened. Light flooded the narrow room in one hard stripe, cutting across the floor and landing straight at her knees. Naomi froze with a piece of bread still in her hand. Slowly, she looked up, and every bit of air left her lungs. Adrian Moretti stood in the doorway in a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, one hand still on the brass handle, his expression unreadable. He had probably come downstairs for coffee or whiskey or one more hour of work before dawn. Instead, he found his black maid crouched on the floor like she didn't belong in the same house she cleaned. Naomi rose too fast and nearly dropped the plate. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered, her voice raw with panic. "I wasn't stealing." Adrian said nothing. His eyes moved from her face to the scraps of food in her shaking hands, then back to her again. In that silence, with the hum of the refrigerator behind her and the smell of cold meat hanging in the air, Naomi realized something far worse than being caught. For the first time since she entered that mansion, Adrian Moretti was truly looking at her. And what he saw made him go completely still. Naomi could not tell which was worse, the hunger still twisting inside her, or the silence Adrian Moretti wrapped around the room like a locked door. He did not raise his voice. He did not call for the house manager. He did not ask the kind of sharp, humiliating questions she had spent her whole life learning how to survive. He simply stood there, one hand in his pocket, the other still resting against the pantry door, looking at the paper plate in her hands as if it offended something deeper than the rules of his house. "How long?" he asked at last. Naomi blinked. Her throat felt tight. "Sir." His eyes lifted to hers, dark and steady, impossible to escape. "How long have you been hiding to eat like this?" The words landed harder than anger would have. Naomi lowered her gaze at once. The marble floor beneath her worn shoes blurred for a second, and she hated that her eyes were burning. She had promised herself years ago that no one would ever see her cry over food. "It is not what you think," she said softly. "I was going to throw it away. I just did not want it to be wasted." Adrian studied her for another long moment. In the bright spill of pantry light, Naomi knew exactly what he saw. A 27-year-old woman in a plain black housekeeping uniform, her hair pulled into a neat bun that had started to loosen at the edges, her fingers trembling around a plate that looked too small to matter in a house this large. What he could not see was the calculator in her mind that never stopped. Rent due in 6 days. Her mother's blood pressure medicine due in 4. Her younger brother Caleb texting that afternoon to say the electric bill in Newark was past due again. Naomi had sent almost every paycheck home since she came to work for the Morettis. It was the only reason she had taken a live-in job in a mansion where even the air felt expensive. Did no one feed you? Adrian asked. There was no softness in his tone, but there was something else now, something colder than indifference. Naomi hesitated, and that hesitation said too much. The staff dining room served meals twice a day, but only if your shift ended on time. Only if someone remembered to tell you. Only if the trays had not already been picked over by people higher up in the household order. In the Moretti mansion, hierarchy did not stop with the family. It ran through the entire staff, like an invisible line everyone was expected to know without speaking of it. Naomi had learned quickly that being new, black, quiet, and easy to ignore placed her at the very bottom of that line. I am fine, she said, because that was what women like her always said when fine was the cheapest lie available. Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He stepped farther into the pantry, and Naomi instinctively moved back until the shelving pressed against her shoulder blades. He looked past her at the neat rows of imported jars, the boxes of expensive tea, the untouched luxuries stacked from floor to ceiling. Then his gaze dropped once more to the cold scraps on her plate. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. You are eating leftovers with your hands in a dark pantry after midnight, and you expect me to believe you are fine? Naomi opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because the truth was too plain, too ugly in a room like this. Fine did not crouch on the floor to eat discarded steak. Fine did not wrap half a dinner roll in a napkin to save for tomorrow. Fine did not pray the rich would waste enough to make it through the week. Adrian exhaled slowly, as if mastering something inside himself. Then he did something Naomi never expected. He reached out, took the paper plate gently from her hands, set it on the shelf beside them, and said, "Come with me." Naomi followed him through the silent kitchen with the kind of dread that made every step feel borrowed. The overhead lights had been dimmed for the night, leaving only the soft amber glow above the stove and the polished shine of steel counters stretching into the dark. Adrian Moretti did not look back to see if she was behind him. He moved with quiet certainty, barefoot on the stone floor now, his white shirt open at the collar, sleeves still rolled to his forearms, as if midnight had stripped away only the formal edges of him and left the rest untouched. Naomi kept her hands clasped tightly in front of her, trying not to imagine what came next. In houses like this, kindness was usually a misunderstanding. It appeared for a second, then disappeared the moment someone remembered your place. Adrian stopped at the long butcher block island in the center of the kitchen and pressed a button beneath the cabinet. Warm light spilled across the room. He opened the refrigerator, glanced once at the untouched trays from the party, then closed it again with a quiet, controlled motion that somehow felt more dangerous than if he had slammed it. "Sit," he said. Naomi stared at one of the leather-backed stools as if it belonged to someone else. In 3 months at the Moretti mansion, she had never sat in the main kitchen. She had stood for hours polishing glassware, scrubbing roasting pans, and carrying silver platters she could never afford to fill on her own table. But sitting was different. Sitting suggested you belonged long enough to rest. "Sir, I should not." Adrian turned and looked at her fully. That was not a suggestion. Naomi sat, carefully, on the very edge of the stool, back straight, knees together, every instinct still telling her she was one wrong breath away from losing the best-paying job she had ever had. Adrian crossed to the pantry, not the dark corner where he had found her, but the main shelves where the house inventory was kept with almost military precision. He pulled out fresh bread, real butter, a container of soup the chef had prepared for the family but never served, and a dish of roasted chicken that had not even been touched. Naomi watched in stunned silence as he set everything on the counter, found a bowl, and ladled the soup with the steady hands of a man who clearly had not done this for anyone in a very long time. Steam rose into the quiet air, carrying the smell of rosemary and garlic, warm and rich and real. Naomi felt her stomach tighten, so sharply it almost hurt. Adrian placed the bowl in front of her, followed by a plate with sliced chicken and thick pieces of bread. Then he stepped back. "Eat." Naomi looked down at the food, then back up at him, unable to hide the confusion on her face. "Sir, you say that word like it can answer for everyone who failed you in this house." His voice was calm, but now there was something under it, something clipped and deliberate, like he was choosing every word with more care than usual. "Eat while it is hot." Naomi reached for the spoon with fingers that still trembled. The first taste nearly undid her. The soup was simple compared to the extravagant meals carried through the mansion every night, but it was hot, seasoned, made for a table instead of a trash bin. She swallowed too fast, embarrassed by the hunger rushing ahead of her manners, and forced herself to slow down. Across from her, Adrian said nothing. He leaned one hand against the counter and watched with an expression she could not read, not pity, not curiosity, but something heavier. The kind of look a person wore when they had seen a truth they could not unsee. Naomi tore a piece of bread and lowered her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Adrian was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Who decided you were allowed to go hungry under my roof?" Naomi's spoon stopped halfway to her lips. The warmth of the soup was still on her tongue, but Adrian's question cooled the entire room. It was not the kind of question a man asked casually. It was the kind that made the truth feel dangerous. Naomi set the spoon down carefully, as if one wrong sound might shatter whatever fragile calm had settled between them. "No one decided that, sir," she said quietly. "It just happened." Adrian's expression did not change, but his eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger at her, but at the answer itself. He had spent most of his life around people who lied with confidence, who dressed cruelty in polished language and called it policy, efficiency, or order. Naomi's answer was different. It was the kind of lie tired people told to protect everyone except themselves. "Things do not just happen in my house," he said. His voice remained low, controlled, almost gentle if a man like Adrian Moretti could be called gentle at all. Someone knew. Someone allowed it. Naomi looked down at the bowl in front of her, at the thin swirl of steam still rising into the warm kitchen air. She had not meant to say anything. She had learned a long time ago that survival often depended less on what you endured than on what you kept quiet. Speak too soon, and people called you difficult. Speak too honestly, and they called you ungrateful. In places like this, where wealth softened everything except the way people looked at you, silence was often the only dignity left. "Miss Evelyn handles the kitchen schedule," Naomi said after a moment, naming the senior house manager without ever lifting her eyes. She said staff meals are for people who finish on time. "If my floor is not done, I miss the tray. If I miss the tray, there is nothing left." Adrian said nothing, so she continued, the words coming out more easily now that they had begun. "Sometimes Chef Marcus saves extra bread. Sometimes he does not. Sometimes the others take food back to their rooms before I get downstairs. I did not want to complain. Everyone works hard here." Adrian's jaw tightened. "And no one thought to mention that one of my employees is missing meals because she is overworked and underfed." Naomi hesitated. "I am the newest one." Adrian let out a slow breath through his nose, a sound so slight another person might have missed it. Naomi did not. She was beginning to understand that his quietest reactions were often the ones that mattered most. Outside the tall windows above the sink, the city slept beneath a cold spring sky, lights glittering beyond the estate grounds like distant stars. Inside, the kitchen felt suspended in time, held together by the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock above the pantry door. Naomi folded her hands in her lap. "I do not want trouble for anyone," she said. "I just need this job." That, more than anything, seemed to reach him. Adrian looked at her the way a man might look at a crack in marble he had walked past 100 times without seeing. Not because it was new, but because suddenly it was impossible to ignore. "How much are you sending home?" he asked. Naomi looked up then, startled. It was the first truly personal question he had asked, and somehow it felt more dangerous than all the others. "Most of it," she admitted. "My mother is sick. My brother is in community college. He works nights, but it is not enough yet." Adrian's gaze held hers for one long second, and something unreadable passed through his face. Not softness. Not exactly. More like recognition wrapped in discipline. "So you stand in rooms full of food every night," he said, "and go hungry so someone else can keep the lights on." Naomi tried to smile, but it faltered before it could become anything real. "That is not unusual where I come from." Adrian straightened, one hand braced on the counter, the other curling once before relaxing again. "No," he said quietly. "But it should be." Then he glanced toward the kitchen door, his expression sharpening with sudden purpose. When he looked back at Naomi, his voice was calm, but final. "Finish your meal. Tomorrow morning, everyone is coming to breakfast." And for the first time since Naomi Carter entered the Moretti mansion, she realized the deepest silence in that house was no longer hers. Naomi did not sleep. She lay awake in the narrow bed of her small staff room, staring at the faint pattern of moonlight on the ceiling, replaying every word. Adrian Moretti had spoken in the kitchen as if the meaning might change by morning. But it did not change. "Everyone is coming to breakfast." The sentence moved through her mind with the slow, certain weight of something that could not be undone. In the Moretti mansion, breakfast was never for staff unless they were serving it. Staff did not sit at the long walnut table beneath the hand-blown chandelier. Staff did not enter the dining room through the front doors with the sun pouring across polished silver and imported linen. Staff stood along the walls, poured coffee, refilled glasses, cleared plates, and disappeared before anyone noticed whether they had eaten at all. Naomi had spent 3 months learning those rules without anyone needing to explain them. That was how houses like this worked. No one had to say the hierarchy out loud because it was built into every glance, every assignment, every tray carried up and down the back stairs. By 6:30 the next morning, the entire estate already felt different. The kitchen was quieter than usual, but it was not peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm no one can predict. Naomi stood at the prep counter folding linen napkins with careful fingers while the others moved around her in clipped, tense motions. Chef Marcus barked fewer orders than usual. 2 junior maids kept glancing toward her and then away. Even the coffee seemed to smell sharper in the air. Miss Evelyn, the senior house manager, entered the kitchen at exactly 6:45 in a navy dress with pearl buttons and a face pulled so tight it looked carved from stone. She stopped the moment she saw Naomi and let her eyes travel slowly over the younger woman's uniform, her posture, the simple gold cross at her throat. "You," she said. Naomi straightened at once. "Yes, ma'am." Miss Evelyn's voice was crisp enough to cut glass. "Mr. Moretti has requested full staff presence in the main dining room at 7 sharp. I trust you understand that means stand quietly, speak only if spoken to, and do not embarrass this house." Naomi felt the words land the way they always did, with practiced precision, meant to remind without ever needing to accuse directly. But this morning something inside her did not fold the way it usually did. Perhaps it was the memory of warm soup at midnight. Perhaps it was the memory of Adrian placing a real plate before her, as if hunger were not a moral failure. Or perhaps it was simply that once a person had been seen, truly seen, invisibility no longer fit the same way. "Yes, ma'am," Naomi said softly. Miss Evelyn held her gaze 1 second longer, then turned on her heel and left. At 6:58, the staff gathered outside the dining room in a line of black and white uniforms, polished shoes, lowered eyes, and tight shoulders. The great room beyond them glowed with morning light. Sun poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, striking crystal glasses and silver coffee service until everything looked too bright, too clean, too expensive for the tension gathering beneath it. Naomi stood at the far end of the line, hands clasped in front of her, pulse beating hard at the base of her throat. She could feel the curiosity around her now, the suspicion, the silent calculations. They all knew something had happened. They just did not know what. Then Adrian Moretti entered from the opposite doorway in a charcoal suit and open collar, calm as winter, his dark eyes sweeping the room once before settling on the staff lined against the wall. The room went still, and when his gaze found Naomi, he did not look past her this time. He looked at her as if the next thing he was about to do would change the order of the entire house. No one moved. For one suspended second, the morning light, the polished silver, the scent of coffee and warm pastries all seemed to belong to another world, one where people were fed, seen, and spoken to with dignity. Then Adrian Moretti crossed the room with the measured calm of a man who had already made his decision long before anyone else understood a choice had been placed before them. He did not stop at the head of the table the way he usually did. He did not glance at Miss Evelyn for the seating plan or ask Chef Marcus whether breakfast was ready. Instead, he walked straight toward Naomi. The entire line of staff seemed to tighten around the movement. Naomi felt every eye in the room turn toward her at once. Her heartbeat became so loud she was certain someone else could hear it. Adrian stopped beside her, his presence filling the space without effort, and for a moment he said nothing. He simply looked at her in that direct, unsettling way that made it impossible to hide behind lowered eyes or polite silence. Then, in a voice so even it somehow carried more authority than shouting ever could, he said, "Naomi, come with me." A ripple of shock passed through the room, small but unmistakable, like a tremor beneath polished floors. Naomi hesitated only a second before stepping out of line. Miss Evelyn's face did not change, but the color drained ever so slightly from it. Chef Marcus lowered his gaze. One of the junior maids parted her lips as if she might speak, then thought better of it. Adrian led Naomi to the dining table, where a full breakfast had already been laid out with the kind of care reserved for guests who mattered. Fresh fruit arranged like still-life art. Soft scrambled eggs with herbs. Thick-cut bacon glistening under silver covers. Buttermilk biscuits wrapped in linen to keep them warm. Crystal glasses catching the sun. Naomi stopped short beside the nearest chair, too stunned to continue. She had polished that table so many times she knew the grain of the wood better than the lines in her own hands. She had never stood at it as anything but background. Adrian reached for the chair at the head of the table and pulled it back himself. The sound of wood gliding softly across the floor seemed to echo through the silence. "Sit," he said. Naomi looked at him, then at the chair, then back at him again as if she had misunderstood the language entirely. "Sir, I cannot." Adrian's expression remained calm, but there was no room in it for refusal. "You can. Sit." Naomi's fingers curled at her sides. "This is not my place." Something in Adrian's face changed then, not dramatically, but enough. It was the look of a man who had heard one insult too many and had no patience left for the lie behind it. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly the problem." The room went so still that even the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded louder. Naomi sat because her knees would not trust themselves standing much longer. She lowered herself into the chair with the fragile caution of someone expecting the moment to be corrected at any second, expecting a sharper voice to cut in and remind everyone who belonged where. But no voice came. Adrian remained beside her, one hand resting on the back of the chair, his gaze lifting from Naomi to the staff gathered near the wall. When he spoke again, his tone was no longer meant only for her. "Every person in this house will listen carefully," he said, "because what happened under this roof last night will not happen again." Miss Evelyn straightened, her pearls catching the sun like tiny points of ice. Chef Marcus looked suddenly older. The 2 footmen near the doorway stood frozen, coffee pots still in hand, before he stepped away. The move was small, almost elegant, but it carried the finality of a verdict. He took his place at Naomi's right instead of at the head of the table, and that single choice sent another silent shock through the staff lined against the wall. Miss Evelyn recovered first, though only just. She drew in a careful breath and clasped her hands in front of her tailored navy dress. "Mr. Moretti," she said, her voice smooth, respectful, and dangerously measured. "If there has been some misunderstanding regarding kitchen procedure, I assure you it can be corrected privately." Adrian turned his head toward her with the kind of stillness that made the room even quieter. "A misunderstanding," he repeated. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "A woman in my house was hungry enough to hide in the dark and eat food headed for the trash, and you would like me to call that a misunderstanding?" Miss Evelyn's mouth opened, then closed. Chef Marcus shifted beside the sideboard, his thick hands tightening around a folded dish towel. Adrian looked from one face to the next, not quickly, not angrily, but thoroughly, as if he intended each person to feel seen in exactly the way Naomi had not been. "Let me make this simple," he said. "No one under this roof will be denied a meal because of rank, schedule, preference, or convenience. No one will be made to feel small for being tired, hungry, poor, new, or easy to ignore. If I discover otherwise, the person responsible will no longer work here." The sentence landed cleanly. No shouting, no theatrical fury, just truth spoken with enough certainty to make the air feel heavier. Naomi lifted her gaze before she meant to and saw something she had never seen on Miss Evelyn's face before. Not irritation, not superiority, fear. Adrian reached for the silver lid nearest Naomi and lifted it himself. Warm steam drifted upward, carrying the scent of eggs, butter, and chives. He served her first. A scoop of eggs, roasted potatoes, fresh fruit. Then he poured coffee into a porcelain cup and set it beside her plate, as naturally as if this had always been the order of things. Eat, he said quietly. Naomi hesitated. Her throat had gone tight again, but for a different reason now. Hunger was still there, but it had been joined by something far more fragile and far more frightening. To be pitted was one thing. To be defended in front of the people who had diminished you was another. That kind of mercy could break a person open. Adrian saw the hesitation and lowered his voice just enough that only the nearest few could hear. You do not need permission to take your place at a table, he said. Naomi looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time since coming to the Moretti mansion, she understood that what frightened the room was not his wealth, his name, or even his authority. It was the fact that once Adrian Moretti decided to restore someone's dignity, no one in that house was powerful enough to take it from her again. Naomi picked up the fork with unsteady fingers, aware that even the smallest sound seemed louder in that room now. Said quietly. The words were simple, but they undid something inside her all the same. Naomi had spent years eating fast, working fast, speaking little, apologizing often, making herself smaller than the space she occupied so no one could accuse her of taking too much. Time had never belonged to people like her. Not in diners where she worked double shifts in high school. Not in hospital waiting rooms with bills folded in her pocket. Not in homes where she cleaned around people expensive enough to forget the names of the women scrubbing their floors. She had learned to live as if urgency were a moral virtue and need itself were shameful. But this morning, with sunlight warming the edge of the table and steam still rising from her plate, Adrian Moretti had done something no one else ever had. He had interrupted her shame before it could speak. Naomi reached for the coffee cup. The porcelain was warm in her hands, and for one fragile second she thought of her mother in Newark, sitting by the apartment window in her robe before dawn, wrapping both hands around a chipped mug as if heat itself could count as comfort. Naomi had not told her mother how hard things had become at the mansion. She always softened the truth when she called home. Said the work was steady. Said the people were demanding but fair. Said she was managing. She did it because her mother already carried too much. Because Caleb was trying to stay in school and keep the lights on. Because the easiest lie to tell the people you love is that you are doing better than you are. Naomi. Adrian's voice was low enough to bring her back without startling her. She turned slightly toward him. Yes, sir. He was quiet for a moment, as if choosing the shape of what came next. No one in this house will make you earn the right to eat again. The sentence settled over her with more force than any public speech could have carried. Naomi blinked once, then lowered her eyes because she could not let the room see how close she was to crying. It was not weakness she felt. It was release, sharp and almost painful, like a knot pulled tight for too many years finally beginning to come undone. She had expected punishment when he found her. At best, she had expected mercy. She had not expected restoration. Around them, the silence held. No one challenged him. No one dared. Miss Evelyn remained stiff near the wall, pearls at her throat, face carefully arranged into obedience. Chef Marcus stood with both hands clasped in front of him, staring at the floor as though he could not bear to meet the truth in full. Adrian lifted his cup, took one measured sip of coffee, then set it down again. He did not need to repeat himself. The room had already understood. Naomi drew in a slow breath and took another bite, and this time the food tasted different. Not richer, not softer, simply honest. For the first time in months, maybe longer, she was not eating to survive the next hour. She was eating without fear. And somewhere deep inside the silence of that grand, beautiful room, Naomi Carter began to understand that dignity did not always return with noise. Sometimes it returned with a chair pulled out, a plate set down, and one man deciding that her hunger would never be hidden again. When breakfast ended, no one rushed to clear the table. The room remained suspended in that strange, fragile silence that follows a truth too large to be folded neatly back into routine. Naomi set down her fork with careful hands and kept her eyes on the linen in front of her, still half afraid that if she looked up too quickly, the morning would vanish and she would find herself back in the pantry with cold scraps and a paper plate. But nothing vanished. The sunlight still poured through the tall windows. The silver still gleamed. Adrian still sat beside her, calm and unreadable, as if restoring a woman's dignity before the entire household was not disruption but correction. Then he rose. The simple movement made every person near the wall straighten at once. Adrian buttoned one cuff, glanced toward Miss Evelyn, and said, "From this moment on, the kitchen schedule changes. Every employee eats before the trays leave the staff dining room. I want written meal logs, shift adjustments where needed, and no one working past dinner service without a hot plate waiting." His voice was quiet, but each word landed with the weight of policy becoming law. Miss Evelyn nodded once, too quickly. "Yes, Mr. Moretti." Adrian's gaze shifted to Chef Marcus. "And if there is ever another night when food is wasted while someone under this roof goes hungry, I will consider it a personal failure of management." Chef Marcus swallowed hard. "Understood, sir." Naomi felt the room absorb the new order like rain falling onto dry ground. No protest. No excuses. No one dared. Adrian turned back toward her then, and the hardness in his face eased just enough to be felt rather than seen. "You should finish your coffee," he said. Naomi obeyed because she did not trust herself to speak. The warmth of the cup settled into her hands, steadying her. Around them, the staff began to move again, but more slowly now, more carefully, as if the house itself had tilted and they were all learning how to stand on new ground. One of the junior maids stepped forward to clear a side plate, and before retreating, she gave Naomi the smallest glance of something that might have been apology. Naomi did not know what to do with that. She barely knew what to do with any of this. She had entered this mansion believing survival meant invisibility. Yet in less than 12 hours, Adrian Moretti had taken the thing she had hidden most fiercely, her hunger, her humiliation, her silence, and turned it into a line no one in the house would ever be allowed to cross again. A little later, when the dining room had emptied and the echo of polished shoes faded down the hall, Naomi finally stood from the chair that still did not feel real beneath her. She expected Adrian to leave first. Men like him always had somewhere more important to be. But he remained near the window, one hand in his pocket, watching the grounds beyond the glass where dew still clung to the hedges and the morning stretched pale and clean over the estate. "Naomi," he said, and something about the way he spoke her name now made it sound less like a command and more like recognition. She turned. "Yes, sir." Adrian studied her for a moment, the way he had in the pantry, the way he had at the table, but now there was no public judgment in the room, no staff to witness whatever passed between them. "Last night was not only about missed meals," he said. Naomi's breath caught. He had seen more than she meant to show. Perhaps he had seen it in the way she wrapped half a dinner roll for later. Perhaps he had heard it in the practiced way she kept saying she was fine. "I do not understand," she said softly, though part of her already did. Adrian glanced toward the chair she had just left, then back at her. "People do not hide food unless they are afraid hunger will return." The words entered the quiet space between them and stayed there. Naomi could not answer. Because he was right. Because the pantry had never been only about one missed meal. It had been about years of stretching rent, splitting medicine, skipping breakfast, smiling on the phone so her family would not hear the emptiness in her voice. Adrian took one slow step closer, not enough to crowd her, only enough to make it clear that he was no longer looking at the smallest part of her struggle. "Tonight," he said, "my driver is taking you home after your shift." Naomi stared at him, startled. "Sir, that is not necessary." "No," Adrian said, his expression turning still again in that way that meant he had already decided. "It is." Naomi opened her mouth to protest, but something in his eyes stopped her. Not fear this time. Certainty. The kind that made refusal feel useless. Adrian looked toward the bright hallway beyond the dining room, then back at her once more. "Because if I am going to fix what was ignored in this house," he said quietly, "I need to see what you have been carrying outside of it." And in that moment, standing in the morning light with the taste of warm coffee still on her lips, Naomi understood that the night he found her hiding in the pantry had not been the end of her humiliation. It had been the beginning of a reckoning much larger than either of them had yet imagined.